Welcome viewers. Thank you so much for taking the time for watching another Geo interview. We are back with another exclusive speaker. We have with us Professor Bann Seng Tan, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Ashoka University, India. Today we will talk with Professor Tan on their recent book, that is International Aid and Democracy Promotion, Liberalization and Emergence. So we would like to welcome you, Professor Tan, to the GEOSTRATA.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Right.
Thank you, Professor. So let's begin with a simple thought. What motivated you to write a book around the dynamics of democracy promotion and foreign aid?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about two things. The first one is the international context for the book. And if my audience is interested, I can also talk a little bit about the context for the book. And if my audience is interested, I can also talk a little bit about the professional context. So let me just first talk about the actual academic context. The book is a reaction to this particular time in international politics. I characterize this time as a time of factless democracy. That means factless as in cowardly democracy and resurgent authoritarianism. It's not just the fact that authoritarian regimes are aggressive about their promotion of their regime type and pushing their preferred ways of doing things. It's the fact that those policymakers who are interested in democracy promotion, they seem to have a lack of a strategy. They don't seem to know how to promote democracy. So my book is an attempt to push back against some of the more aggressive forms of authoritarianism. I want to be clear. The prescriptions in my book do not solve some of the crises within liberal democracy. They are very long, they are very systematic, they are severe. But I want to suggest that if you implement some of the strategies in my book, it may buy us some time to fix some of the serious problems within liberal democracy. So that is the academic context. At the more professional context, at the more personal level, why did I work on this book? You may or may not know, my PhD is actually, the dissertation in my PhD was actually on the democratic piece, which is not on foreign aid. The norm in a political science PhD is that after you do your dissertation, you try to convert your dissertation into the book. I did not do that. My next project will be on my democratic piece, which is on the dissertation book project. One reason why I started to focus on foreign aid was because near the end of my PhD process, I basically got a visiting assistant professorship at the College of William and Mary, which is based in Virginia, United States. Now, William and Mary has a think tank. The think tank is called Aid Data. So Aid Data do a lot of empirical research on the foreign aid. And then I realized that their foreign aid data sets are very useful. So I started to learn more and more about foreign aid. And I realized that their dissertation project, their empirical projects are useful enough for me to, in a sense, start to focus on foreign aid. So as I pursue the book on the research on foreign aid, it started to develop a theory, some empirical quantitative chapters, and some case studies. As it developed in its substance, I decided, okay, why not just develop it into a full book project? So I got a book contract from the editor at Routledge, and then I started to work on the book, and then it developed into the book that you see today. Yeah.
It was a very interesting anecdote in the sense how you actually, defied the norm and started another project right after your PhD. So very interesting take on that. So building upon this, could you please unwrap the overall argument of your book and the selective theory that you use to sort of support your arguments, and how could that be understood by a layman, let's say?
Sure. So I'm going to focus mainly on the arguments of the book. Near the end, I will just give a short summary about the selective theory. So this book fundamentally is an attempt to understand the aid dynamics of bargaining between the aid donors and the aid recipient. And I want to use the insight from that in order for the cost of democracy promotion. Since I'm speaking to a general audience, sometimes it's useful to start with a pair of contrasting examples. So that's what I'm going to do. So I want to draw your audience attention to 2013, when there was a military coup where the General LCC overthrew the elected government of Mohammad Morsi. Immediately after the coup, the United States came under political pressure to cut off its foreign aid to Egypt. Let me just give a context. There's a law passed by Congress, and this is an act of government where it requires the automatic suspension of American foreign aid to any government that has underwent a military coup. At that time, the White House is under the Obama administration. The Obama administration refused to cut off any foreign aid to Egypt. And any punishment for the military coup was very light, very symbolic. In fact, the White House went out of its way to deny what happened in Egypt as a military coup. Because the moment you call it a military coup, there's a legal ramification. Now you have to cut off foreign aid, which the American administration didn't want to do. And I draw that in contrast to another setback into democracy. This was in 2006 in Fiji, a Pacific island. There, after the military coup, the United States administration have no problem cutting off foreign aid to Fiji, demanding a return to democracy as a precondition for the resumption of aid. Citing the same act of Congress, it refused conspicuously to apply with regards to Egypt. So this means there is a puzzle. Why is it that there's two setbacks to democracy? The United States as an aid donor has a very different way of reacting to these two coups. So the claim, the main argument is that the US the donor is reacting very differently depending on how important the recipient is to the donors. Egypt is important. Because it is important, the West as a donors are not very willing to apply that much diplomatic pressure on Egypt. Fiji is not important. Because it is not important, the West is more or less willing to indulge in a call for democracy. So what does this mean? It means that theoretically, recipient salience, how important the recipient is to donors in general, is now a key variable. So I start to build a theory. I identify a class of aid recipients that have a lot of value. They have diplomatic leverage. They are able to resist donor pressure. So for the sake of subsequent statistical analysis, I'm going to call them the primary recipients. You can think of this as the Egypts of the aid of the recipient world. So I'm focusing on this group, and I argue that when you put diplomatic pressure on the Egypts of the aid recipient world, is likely to fail. It's likely not to end up enhancing democracy. My insight is to suggest that there should be another group of recipients which don't have that much to offer, which lacks leverage. This group of recipients, I call them the secondary recipients. Now you can, if you like, you can think of them as the Fijis of the aid recipient world. This group of recipients are more susceptible. They are more vulnerable to donor pressure. When you persuade them using foreign aid to advance democracy, you are more likely to succeed. So therefore, the argument of my book is that as an aid allocation strategy, you should focus on the secondary recipients, not the primary recipient. A strategy that targets the secondary recipients, that I call it a strategy of liberalization at the margins. So in the book, this is the subtitle of the book where I talk about the liberalization at the margins, right? So in a sense, that encapsulate as a nutshell the argument of the book. Now, the other point that was already hinted at was this issue of selectorate theory. So it's a pretty long theory, and I'm just going to give a short overview, the synopsis. It's associated with the arguments of Bruce Bueno de Mascuta and a group of scholars based around New York University. That theory is a middle range theory where they talk about the imperative of your policymakers to seek political survival. And in their quest for political survival, they might be driven or inclined towards certain types of policies. So the theory has a nice way of explaining why democratic policymakers tend to prefer certain types of policy and why authoritarian policymakers tend to systematically prefer other types of policies. That theory can have been applied to things like international conflict, or in this case, applied to foreign aid, right? Why is it that democratic donors prefer to give foreign aid, all other things being equal, towards an authoritarian aid recipient as opposed to a democratic aid recipient? Why is it that, according to the selective theory, democracies normally don't promote democracies? If anything, they typically promote autocracies and so on. So my book is, in a sense, responding to that particular academic literature. Right?
The very start of the story of your book is very interesting, Professor Tan, in the sense how one might be, able to keep their eyes open to what goes on across the world and see how actors are responding in one particular way in one instance, but in some other way in some other instance, which would have been equal to the first one. So, and what this drives from is the idea of being open to questioning what happens and questioning this contrasting behavior and seeing what insights can one derive from such questions. So, building upon this, we also noticed that your book has a lot of quantitative side to it, as opposed to, let's say, the trend of the current times. Like there's a lot of qualitative side of case studies, but you focus on hard facts, hard numbers to drive home your argument. So, building upon this, could you briefly walk us through the methodology that you have employed in your book to sustain your argument?
Sure, I can do that. So I'm going to talk, the methodology in the book consists of both statistics and case studies. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of the stats, and then we'll move on to the case studies. And in both cases, I will be focusing on the big picture. So let's talk about the stats. I have a data set, and the data set was an original one when I compiled data on the donors' intention with regards to their aid project, as well as the aid recipients' regime characteristics. So I use aid data 2.1, that particular version of the data set, and I use the polity 4 to measure regime characteristics. So this give me a novel data set. Now that data set has a domain from approximately 1973 to 2006. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the variables in the data set. The dependent variable, that is the outcome, is basically the change, the regime change in the aid recipients 5 years after aid commitment. So it's used, is a regime change statistics, but this is from the polity 4 regime, composite regime score. Now, I have 3 independent variables. The first independent variable is this idea of recipient salience, how important the recipient is to donors in general. I built a composite index with subcomponents. So it's a composite, right? It's an aggregator index. It tries to capture information on strategic value and the commercial value of a given aid recipient. My other independent variable is this idea of donor pressure, which is trying to measure to what that is an indicator, a proxy indicator of whether the recipient at that moment is under some kind of diplomatic pressure from the aid donors. So take note, now I have 2 independent variables, recipient salience and donor pressure. My argument is conditional. I am speculating based on my theory that the same donor pressure that fails on or fail to be effective on the primary recipient might actually be effective on the secondary recipient. That means this is what we call sometimes a conditional argument, right? Depending on the status of the recipient, it can or may not be successful. So this means that methodologically, I now need to create a third independent variable called an interaction term that you derive by multiplying the donor pressure with the recipient salience. That means now I have 3 independent variables the recipient salience, donor pressure, and the independent, the interaction term. So what do I do with all these variables? I include a whole set of control variables. The details are in the book, and I do multiple robustness checks. The main point here is that I use regression analysis on the panel data with country fixed effects. The reason why I use country fixed effects is because my theory is not explaining every single cause of democratization in a given aid recipients. I'm focusing on that cause of democratization or political liberalization that is due to foreign aid. That means it can be reliably attributed to donor pressure from the outside. So I'm not explaining every single situation of democratization, only those that are linked reliably to foreign aid. Now, so that's the big picture. The other chapters in the book, I spread out and I examine the data over different ways of slicing the econometrics. In chapter 2, I explore the data on a global scale. In chapter 3, I disaggregate the recipient salience into their components parts, and then I test on them individually. The reason why I do that is to answer the question whether an individual subcomponent is actually more salient, more important than others. So that means I test for whether my variable of recipient salience is an artificial construct or not. In chapter 4, I segregate the data into regional groups. So I focus on Asia and Africa, and I look for regional dynamics. I want to understand whether the same donor pressure may be more effective in one region compared to another. So that covers the statistics. I also have case studies which I use to illustrate this theory. My case studies talk about Egypt, Burma, Myanmar, as well as Fiji. How do I choose those case studies? The case of Egypt was chosen on the spectrum of recipient salience. Egypt is a representation of a primary recipient. It has a lot of bargaining power. I show how Hussein Mubarak, over the 30 years in Egypt, was able to deflect American pressure to liberalize. By contrast, I focus on Fiji as a case study. Fiji is a case of the opposite salience. It represents a secondary recipient. It has very little salience. After the military coup, I traced the activist foreign policy of the military junta of Fiji. I show how they set up their own international organization. They try to go to China to look for foreign aid and so on. And I show that because it has very little to offer, it actually doesn't have that much of bargaining power. And in 2014, it was persuaded to hold multi-party election and return back to democracy. In the case of Myanmar, I talk about how Myanmar is a moderate case. That means it's in between the primary recipient and the secondary recipient. And I show how the junta try to play one donor group against another. So they try to switch from the Western camp to the Chinese camp, and how they try to switch back. So here in the case study, I talk about the phenomena of donor switching when the recipient try to play one donor group against another. So these are the case studies. And the point here is that it's an overview. The statistics are the one that test the theory. The case studies are the one that illustrate the theory. Thank you.
Interesting in the sense, there are still tools available within the large domain of political science, which one can use to substantiate case studies and arguments with a lot of data, which a lot of people don't take seriously these days, like students, let's say, to say the least. So, what was your experience in using so much of data in political science to drive home your arguments? What does this? Would you like to convey something in terms of methodology to students, to scholars who are actually serious about the entire discipline of political science?
Okay, sure. I will give it a shot, right? So my PhD is from America, so City University, New York. I'm trained in a particular school of thought where if you want to study political science or if you want to study international relations, when you make an argument, it's not just purely abstract. It has to be based in certain empirical evidence. That means if you have a good theory, you should be able to get predictions or hypotheses, and then there should be empirical, and there should be some data to test the hypothesis. So in a sense, theory building or advancing knowledge is contingent on the quality of the data. That means to do proper science, you have to deal with phenomena that is quantifiable, that is measurable. So when you can do that, you are now following a particular tradition, which for lack of a better phrase, I'm going to call it social science. That means it's not like humanities, it's actually empirical. This is important because if you have empirical data, you can falsify a theory. And falsification of a theory is an important tool to advance knowledge. So it's a hallmark of social science, by which I mean proper normal scientific theory, right? Yeah.
Perfect, makes sense. We'll try our best to, let students, scholars, far and wide know about this view of looking at data and arguments. Building upon your donor switching point, which is very unique in itself, if alternative donors, let's say China, use the instrument of foreign aid without the democracy conditionality, would this not automatically undermine the donor pressure of, let's say, Western donors such as the United States?
Yes. Yes and no. Let me qualify. Right. I know in the popular literature, there's a lot of media talk about the rise of China, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which and that is implication of Chinese foreign aid to be used as a tool by authoritarian aid recipient to deflect or push away donor pressure. The argument that is in the popular literature runs a bit like this. I am under pressure from the West to democratize. I don't want to democratize. So therefore, I turn to the Chinese for foreign aid. Because the Chinese don't really care about democracy promotion, the fact that I can get Chinese aid without the democratization conditionality is now what we call in game theory exit option. That China serve as the exit option to respond to Western pressure. The assumption is that the presence of China as an exit option automatically negates Western pressure. My studies and the case study of Myanmar suggest that may not be true. I show how in the case study, the existence of an alternative patron, in this case China, may not necessarily end up in the aid recipient's favor. Under some conditions, may use their increased leverage to extract more concessions from the aid recipients. And because the concession can be painful and costly, at some point, the aid recipient under pressure may decide to donor switch back to the initial donors as a way of restoring leverage. So this is very abstract. Let me give a teaching example from something that will be more topical to illustrate what I mean. I'm going to draw a teaching example from sanctions, the sanctions literature. So it runs a bit like this. So many of your readers and audience will be familiar with the war on Ukraine. So as a result of the war on Ukraine, the West put sanctions on Russia. That means Russia can no longer sell its energy supplies to the West. The Russian response is to say, hey, it's okay. I have alternative customers. I can sell it to India. I can sell it to China. So India and China are now the exit option for Russia. Here's the catch. Even though Russia can sell the oil to India or China, they would want the oil to be bought as the highest possible price, which is, let's be honest, is the Western price, right? They want the same price as, say, Germany is willing to pay on the international market. When they turn around to a country like India to buy that price, to buy at that Western price, which is the German market price, the Indians and the Chinese are saying, no, I'm not going to buy it at that price because you can't sell it on the Western market. It has to be sold at a discount before the Indians and the Chinese will be able to buy it. And that discount is going to be substantial. It's going to be large. Which means what? Even though the Russians have an alternative market, they are selling the oil at a discount below the market price they could have ordinarily gotten. And that discount can be very large. It can be very painful from the Russian point of view. Which means that if I am Putin, which I'm not, but if I'm Putin, it might be in my interest to try to reach some kind of accommodation with the West, because the Western pressure is now hurting my ability to sell the oil at the price I would like to have gotten from the Chinese and from the Indians. So this is just purely rational. It has nothing to do with whether I like the West or I like the Chinese. The issue is, what is the best way to get the best price I can get from the oil? And I'm arguing that sometimes the best way is to make sure that not just you have an alternative market, you also have to make sure that you have access to your original first market. Because once you have that, then now you can switch reliability between the alternative market. Then that will mean that the discount you have to offer will be smaller. That gets you a better price. My insight is to apply this from sanctions, and I apply this to foreign aid. And I'm showing that sometimes the aid recipients might be forced to liberalize anyway, if only because it's a way of getting more leverage against their chosen donor groups. So I show how that happened in the case of Myanmar, right? How they were persuaded reluctantly to return to democracy, right? So to speak. Right?
That's really insightful in this, when you use the Russian example and you talk about rationality, and in terms of how a rational foreign policy would look like. And then when we introduce other elements, let's say sentiments, or let's say domestic consequences to it, and then things turn around and let's say a foreign policy becomes more or less a domestic policy. I don't know if you would agree to this conclusion or not, but also building upon your insight, which is at the state level, we also see alternative institutions cropping up under the BRICS framework. For example, the Asian Development Bank, or let's say the BRICS New Development Bank. And then there's currency swap agreements happening between these global South countries which want to, not acknowledge or not bear the dollar hegemony anymore. Do you see, like now, if these countries, if these developmental banks advance loans without the democracy conditionality, which is not the case with, let's say, World Bank loans, where also the US has a lot of US or the West has a lot of say or a lot of heft. Do you see, if these non-Western institutions, lending institutions crop up and they're attaining a sizable scale, which they are slowly, do you see the democracy conditionality of the West changing over time?
So I think I'm going to respond to you by making a few qualifiers. The first point is the book, or in the field of foreign aid, there's a distinction between bilateral aid, that means just between one donor and one aid recipient, and multilateral aid, where you have, let's say, like as you mentioned, World Bank or the BRIC, the Asian Development Bank, a big multilateral organization giving loan as part of the organization. That means it's a many-to-one type of relationship. So in the foreign aid literature, there's a distinction between the two, right? So I would like my audience to be clear. The book, right? This book is mostly about bilateral aid. It's not about multilateral aid. So to that extent, it doesn't actually talk about things like World Bank or some of your multinational lending. Among other things, when you include multinational organizations, it's more complicated because now you have multiple state actors sharing a membership of a big organization. So now you have to talk about the politics of the organization, right? And that the different international organizations are dominated by different countries. So, for example, the World Bank and the IMF are usually Western dominated. I'm trying to recall offhand. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure the IMF is usually is more European dominated, whereas the World Bank is more American dominated. I think there's a deal between the American donors and the European donors that by tradition, the Europeans appoint the chief executive of the IMF. So different organizations have different dynamics depending on the coalition and depending on who is the most important actor within the multilateral organization. What does this mean? It means that it's no longer bilateral. It's actually quite complicated because there is both the state-to-state bargaining, and then there is the within the international organization bargaining. So there's a multiple layer. The game becomes a lot more complicated. So could I study this? Yes, I could. Are there scholars that study this? Yes, they are. So for example, I think one of them is a Randall Stone. He has a book where he talks about, my book doesn't actually talk about multinational laws. Now, next point. I think you are speculating over this issue of whether if the multinational organizations don't really care about democratization, does that in a sense weaken the leverage of the Western donors that are interested in democratization? The short answer is generally the answer is yes. But again, this is context to context, because many of the standard Western-led multilateral organizations in their official constitution, in their focus on what they say, what they declare, they usually say that democratization is not their primary priority. There are exceptions. One exception is the American-led Millennium Challenge Fund. So that one is initiated by President Bush. So that one, they do focus on democratization. But by and large, a lot of your international lending organization, their concerns are usually either commercial or developmental. Usually, they don't focus on democracy promotion. So democracy promotion tend to be more of a bilateral concern. The big exception I can think of would be the European Union with their good governance or their good neighborhood policy, right? So the European Union do care about democracy promotion, and they do use their foreign aid and their developmental aid as a tool to encourage democratic reforms in aspirant EU candidates that want to ascend to join the EU. Right?
Thank you so much for that insight, Professor. It really helps to keep in mind, what are the correct questions to ask, and then what are the arguments that one needs to think, and the resources that one needs to draw upon while thinking. So this conversation really adds a lot of substance, a lot of direction to, somebody's mind who wants to, let's say, probe a particular aspect of foreign policy or international affairs. So to conclude this conversation, lastly, what would be your message to students and researchers in political science?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to respond to your question by asking you a few questions of my own, right? So when you say the students and the researchers, do you mean you want me to give advice to new candidates joining a PhD in political science and IR? Is that what you mean?
Yes, we can say that. Yes.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to give a slightly flippant answer, but I'm quite sincere. I guess if you're thinking about doing a PhD in political science or IR, my first response is don't do it. But I know it sounds silly, right? But let me just elaborate. The issue here is that if you want to do a PhD in political science and IR, presumably the goal is not just a PhD. You want a PhD because it qualifies you eventually to get a job in academia, to become a professor, teaching in a college, and so on. So my first advice is, before you enter into the program, you should take some time to analyze the job market for such PhDs. There is a severe mismatch between the supply of PhD holders, people who want a job, and the demand for such people. That means the number of actual college openings, the number of job openings. Because of this mismatch, there are far more candidates than there are job openings, which means that any single position that open up, you want to apply for the job, you and just about everybody in the country, and because the PhD market is an international market, everybody in the world is applying for that same job. Even if you are talented, you are very good in your work, then there can be easily somebody else who's just as talented, just as hardworking, which means that the odds of getting a job is very low. So my point, and because I don't want you to waste several years of your life on the chance of getting a job, do your homework about the job market before you do it, before you enter it. You follow? So for example, just as a teaching example, if I say mainstream, that means those broadsheet newspapers like New York Times and big newspapers, if journalism is a dying market, there's not enough jobs, and then you are a young journalist trying to enter the market, I think the decent thing to tell the young journalist is that, think about this carefully, right? If you're entering a dying market, you may put yourself into a really bad position. You follow? So just as on a personal level, because I don't want your young 20-year-olds to waste your life. So I think you really should do your homework first. So that's me trying to help you. But in my experience, even I give the sincere advice, they refuse to listen. They're going to insist on doing it anyway. So if you insist on doing it, what will be some of the things you need to do to maximize your chance of getting a job? Number one, make sure you get into the top school, because the more highly ranked schools are more recognized. Not all PhDs are equal. Get into the best schools you can get into that particular field. After you get into the school, try to be very careful about who you work with as your advisor, because that guy who is your advisor will be the one writing your letter of recommendation. So you need a very good working relationship with that advisor, and he's going to have a major say in the future trajectory of your career. And then you need to quickly set yourself up as a junior scholar with a publishing record. That means even though you are doing your PhD, you should be thinking about how can you turn whatever you are studying into a publishable peer-reviewed journal, so that you can now build a reputation, so that you can show on your CV that you have a publishing track record, so that when you apply for a job, they are more likely to take you seriously compared to a new candidate that has very little publishing record. So that's going to take time. And then you still need to finish your dissertation, because your dissertation will take a long time. So a quick advice about the dissertation, which I learned from many other scholars, is that your dissertation is not your final project. Don't waste too many years trying to perfect your dissertation. It's just your first draft. Hence the expression you use. A good dissertation is a written one. Everybody's unwritten dissertation can be as good as you sound, but it's never written. If it's never written, you're not going to get a PhD. If you don't get a PhD, nobody is going to take your candidacy seriously. So the thing here is not to write the perfect book, which will take a very long time. Just write a good enough dissertation. Get it out. After you get your dissertation, concentrate on publishing. So this could mean journal articles, and eventually it could mean writing a book. Usually for most candidates, their first book is their dissertation, because they've done the most work on it. So in my case, I did a slightly different route. My first book actually wasn't my dissertation. So this was don't follow what I did. Do it the correct way, which is a dissertation. Which means that when you choose your dissertation, you probably should think ahead about how to turn it eventually into a book. And if the dissertation cannot, is not a book length project, talk to your advisor. Your advisor will know this. Right? Then maybe you want to think carefully whether you want to pursue that dissertation or not. Now, the other point I want to say is this. Sometimes people can be very obsessed about getting a job, right? So they choose their research based on what they think the market would want. Example, right? So many young Indian 20-year-olds, they think that, okay, maybe the IT industry or computer engineering will be the next in thing. So everybody studies to be a computer engineer. You notice what happens if you do that, right? There will be a massive oversupply of computer engineer. That's exactly what's happening, right? Which means that you may not want to, you want to be strategic about what you study. You want to study something that is market relevant, but there is a risk on focusing on only market relevant research, because you are making a prediction on what the market will be like 5 or 10 years after you finish your PhD. Your guess may be wrong. If you guess wrongly, then you were stuck with an expertise in the research that the market doesn't care about. So that's the problem, right? This idea, how confident are you in your theory, where what is at stake is your own personal career. So my advice, and this is just personal, this applies to different people, because you will be working on your dissertation for a very long time. By and large, you should choose something that you are personally interested in, something that you care about. So for me, I care about democracy. I care about the decline of the liberal world order. Because I care about it, even the dark periods, even the periods of depression when you're working on your book, when nobody else cares about your book except you, right? Your interest in the book, because this is personally worthwhile to you, will be the reason why you will finish the book. If you are only interested in it tactically because you think it will get you a job, that interest may not be good enough for you to finish the book. So that's the problem. Do you follow? You may lose your passion for it. Right. Now, next point. The other thing that I would say as a career advice is that if you are determined to give it a try to get a PhD or a master's in, let's say, political science or IR, you want to think about what I described as a backup plan. What happens if you fail to get a job? That means don't just focus on getting an academic job. Think about what other jobs you can get while you are pursuing your master's and your or your PhD. What do I mean? What you want is to focus on the skills. Let's say when you're in a Western PhD program, try to learn some kind of quantitative skills that will be useful in the non-academic job market. Let's say a think tank or a research institute or some kind of, I don't know, one of the large multinational companies. They always want people who can do statistical analysis. That means those skills that you can acquire as part of your PhD program can be useful outside of academia. You may not, you want it just as a backup plan in case your primary plan to enter academia fails. Do you follow? So let me summarize. First point, do market research. Before you spend 10 years of your life, please do a little bit research of the job market, right? Because you really shouldn't jump in before you've done your research about this. So treat this as the most important research project that you can do right now, right? Is it worth investing 10 years of your life into it? If you're going to do this, do the research about your new school. Who are the scholars you want to work with? What do they study? Are you interested in that area as well, right? And then finally, when you're in the program, think about what kind of skill sets you want to acquire.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that very realistic dose of advisory for those who want to, venture very deep into this field. We would also, endeavor to flash it far and wide through our platform.
Yeah.
So just to summarize to our audience this conversation, we talked about Professor Tan's book, International Aid and Democracy Promotion. We will link that book on the description itself if you want to read it. And so we talked about the various phases of democracy aid and what are the very politics that goes on internally and also externally, which determines how one state behaves in one particular way towards others, but not in the same way to some other states. Very interesting conversations and also a lot of food for thought for political scientists and students. So Professor Tan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It is my pleasure, right?